2 of our conversation with our special guest, Bill Frist, former Senate Majority Leader and a doctor, and one of Princeton's men in the nation's service and in the service of nations. That was Princeton's motto. In this segment, we hope to talk to him and see about Bill Frist as a person, about his experiences in the Senate, and about his views on a range of issues, among them healthcare in America. Welcome, Senator Frist.
Hey, great to be with you today.
It's a great pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Do you miss being in the Senate after having been there for 12 years, and for 6 years of that you were the majority leader, a powerful and influential position?
May, I did what not many politicians do, and that was, in coming to the Senate, I said that I would stay for 12 years, said it right up front, as a citizen legislator, and come back home and live under the laws that are passed. So I've known for all 12 years, really since I started running back in 1993, that it would be just 12 years. And this concept of the citizen legislator is one I believe in strongly. People don't go there with a career to protect like a lot of the long-term politicians, but you really go there to serve and then leave. So I am glad that I made that commitment. I felt like I've served 12 years to the best of my ability, and now I'm back in the private sector as a regular old citizen out there contributing to my family and community and economy. So I miss the day-to-day to it in many ways, but it was absolutely the right thing to do. 12 years, commit to that, and then come home.
What, in your own view, are the proudest achievements during your years in the Senate?
Oh, gosh. You know, you go there for a reason, or at least I did, and I'd done 20 years of medicine before, and then went to the Senate to extend that concept of healing one-on-one, which I did my best to do in medicine, to one on a community or a larger group of people. And looking at that health of that community, the state, Tennessee, 7 million people, and then as majority leader, almost 300 million people in this country. And the reason I went there was looking at that health. So you look at issues like the Medicare Modernization Act. 4 years ago in this country, our senior citizens, 40 million strong, did not have affordable access to prescription drugs. And unlike when Dad practiced medicine, or I did when I started, that prescription drug is the most powerful tool in the toolbox, in the armamentarium of a physician. And yet we denied that to seniors under our Medicare program. So the fact today, I can say that every senior in this country has affordable access to prescription drugs under Medicare, which they did not 4 years ago, means a lot. It means more preventive care. It means that people can get on a medicine to treat their high blood pressure before they have a heart attack and have to come see Bill Frist, a heart transplant surgeon. So that, to me, is probably the single greatest achievement and accomplishment over the last 12 years.
But you know, I know you're very proud of the Medicare Part D, they call it, prescription drug benefit. But there were criticisms, the donut hole, that seniors have to spend, what, upwards of $1,500 before the benefit kicks in? Now, that is a financial burden on a number of the seniors. Plus, also people say, well, you know, the law says that the government is not allowed to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical companies, and therefore the drug prices are much higher.
Well, it's interesting.
But you were there on the Senate floor, so you know the policy environment. You know how politics work. Give us your perspective on that.
It is fascinating, and it changes over time. Basically, the problem is clear, that people were dying, seniors, after we'd made a moral commitment through health care, through Social Security and Medicare, to look at health care security for seniors. That was our moral commitment that we've made. Yet we totally excluded prescription drugs. They were not a part of Medicare. Medicare prescription drugs were not a part. They were written in there that we will not cover prescription drugs on an outpatient basis. So that's the problem. That was the problem. The second problem was that people didn't have the money to buy them, even on the outside. So what we wanted to do is design a program that accomplished exactly what we said, that all 40 million people have affordable access. Doesn't mean it's free. If you want free drugs, that's not what it does. But what it does do for every senior, on average, gives them about $1,400 of benefit, new benefit that they didn't have before, on average, of the 40 million people, $1,400 of additional benefit in purchasing power. And yes, there's a donut hole because the drugs are not free. Now the second issue, and the donut hole basically means that up to a level of $3,500, you get 80% coverage, but above that, you're going to have to pay for it for a period of time. And then after that period of time, $5,500, you get everything paid for, or 95% free. Why is there a donut hole? Because there's not enough money. We put about $400 billion into this program. The second issue was that the poor people under the old system were punished. Under the new system that we did through the Medicare Modernization Act, there's a huge redistributive ethic that's placed into it that is means tested in the sense that if you are poor, you get your drugs in essence for free on a gradual basis moving up. Now, when I passed it, Republicans said we shouldn't be expanding entitlements. It's the single greatest expansion of entitlement in the history of entitlements in this country, a Republican doing that. And the Democrats basically said, instead of spending $400 billion, you need to spend $800 billion, and therefore they opposed the bill. Here we are 3 years later. The overall satisfaction of the program is at 90% among the seniors. That's higher than any other government program today, higher than Medicare overall, higher than Social Security, higher than any other government program.
That is
and
great.
The cost savings coming in because it introduced, your second point, competition has meant instead of costs going up at a certain figure, they're going up 30% less. We predicted the average senior would be paying $41 a month, just by certain standards. Right now they're paying about $28 a month. Why? Because there's competition. Because big government's not at the table negotiating. Real quickly, you have one company maybe negotiating for 2 million people, one for 5 million people, one for 8 million people, one for 6 million people, one for 2 million, and they're all negotiating prices against these big drug companies and negotiating lower and lower and lower and lower. Put big government over there, all these players leave. And then you have just big government. And then you'd have a system, yes, kind of like the veterans system, which is kind of okay, but it is restricted to a formulary of, for example, 300 drugs and no more. Is that good or is that bad? You have to ask the American people. Do they want to be restricted to drugs that may not have what their doctor recommends? The American people say no to that. So it's interesting and very successful to date, very controversial program, huge redistribution in terms of the rich to the poor. And the big thing is that for the first time, every senior has affordable access to the most powerful tool in American medicine today, and that is prescription drugs that they didn't have 4 years ago.
You also persuaded President Bush to commit big money to global AIDS relief.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, that's interesting. And what you're talking about is that President Bush and government, representatives of the American people, made the single largest commitment to a single disease in the history of mankind. And that started, it's a long story, but I was the only physician in the United States Senate, going back to the citizen legislator concept. We have a representative government, but there was no doctors, there were no scientists when I came to the United States Senate. When I was a resident at Mass General, nobody had died of HIV/AIDS in this country. In 1981 and then in 1983, the first few cases started coming forward. And over my practice in medicine, I saw 500 people die of HIV/AIDS, and then 1,000, and then 5,000, and then 500,000, then 1 million, and then 10 million, and then 23 million people die just over a very short period of time. I'm not that old. I saw 23 million people die. I used to go to Africa. I still go to Africa on medical mission trips. I would take care of HIV/AIDS patients in the Sudan, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda, through that area. And I would come back and I would talk to the administration. I would say, if we invest in prevention, care, and treatment, instead of having 60 million people die in the future of this little virus that really wasn't around, at least in this country, until 1980, if we invest, we literally can change the course of humanity. And instead of having 50 to 60 million people die, it might just be 30 million people. How do we do it? By asking the American taxpayer for $15 billion over 5 years.
15 billion.
15. huge amount. During the Clinton administration, when I was fighting for this same cause, we were spending about $200 million a year. And then President Bush jumped it up to $3 billion a year. And the Congress, Democratic Congress, right now, working with President Bush, is now going to push it up over the next 5 years to $50 billion. 5-0. And these are the dollars that are kind of hard, but this is where we started, this is where we are, and this is where we're going. And it's having an impact. People are living
What kind
today.
of impact? And do you have any idea how many lives you have saved?
Well, right now, the figures that are given are up at, say, 2 to 3 million people right now, lives will be saved over the next 10 years. As I said, probably around 15 million people will be saved over time just by the current investment. But we're not winning yet. It's going to take continued investment. And it means prevention, care, and treatment. We've learned you can't treat your way out of this disease. It is too expensive. For every one person coming in the door today that you can put on antiretroviral treatment, ARVs, it's expensive, a couple $100 in Africa, which is a lot of money. For every one person coming in, there are going to be 4 new infections on that same day. And therefore you can't treat your way out of it.
The key is prevention.
You've got to come back to prevention.
So what are you doing there?
Well, prevention, great institutions like the National Institutes of Health, like the Gates Foundation, are focused on a vaccine that can prevent. If you get exposed to the virus, prevents the infection.
Is that coming along?
No, it's not. We, the NIH has invested right at $37 billion. That's huge amount of money. Taxpayer money. I said the NIH is all the taxpayers' money.
Government.
But $37 billion since 1981, a huge amount. And right now, that little virus is so canny. It's constantly changing shape and morphing every few seconds. And so to try to build a vaccine that identifies it, by the time you've done that, it shifts around. So every vaccine to date has failed. But really, you almost have to have a vaccine, ultimately. And so it's going to take continued research from the private sector, the Gates Foundation, the Harvard Medical School, and the great academies, as well as the NIH. The other thing is behavior, cultural behavior, and that really comes down to education. Probably the single most important thing you can do on the ground in Africa, and I spend 2 to 3 weeks to a month in Africa every year, is educate young girls. Isn't that interesting? Keep them in school from about the 6th grade to the 8th grade, and teach basic sort of cultural behavior, but also keep them in school where predators can't take advantage of them. So we need to do a lot better in terms of prevention. Care is going pretty good. Treatment is going. We've made huge advances with the United States commitment. And let me just close on that and say that the United States is the most generous in the world. Of the global efforts, the United States is paying somewhere between 30 and 60%, depending on the program, of all the efforts to fight HIV/AIDS. And so although people are critical of the United States and overall development funds, we are clearly the world leader in terms of research, in terms of prevention, in terms of care, in dollar investment. Clearly the world leader in fighting HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis.
I just want to add this. I have met African nuns, the African Catholic leadership, tell me that in Africa they're distributing condoms to people because condoms save lives.
Right, yeah. And the ABCs really came out of Uganda, of abstinence, and abstinence really sort of means fidelity to one person, of being faithful to that one person, and then condoms. And with that, it's been amazing. The evangelical, the religious community has come on board. Now, some might just stress be faithful in the abstinence or education, and some might stress condoms. Let me also say the United States is the #1 distributor, the United States government is the #1 distributor of condoms in the world. You know, people get criticized, say, and say that, you know, that Republican leadership, you know, they're not out there doing it. Right now, we are the #1 distributor in the world. But a lot more to be done. It's a great story for the American people to hear, because a huge investment, it's had a huge impact. It changed the course of history. It's Americans leading the world, but we're still losing the battle.
Looking at the home front, in the past few years, the problem of the uninsured has grown. Every year we get about 1 million more uninsured in America. Why has there been no progress? Why is the problem getting worse?
Yeah. It is over the last 5 years, the percentage of uninsured in this country has gone up to about 16%. It's gone up a little bit every year. It is true about 7 years ago, we were up at around 15.8%. So
of the
it's
population.
Of the population. But the absolute numbers are going up in the last 5 years, it's getting worse. And
47 million today.
47 million today, of which 10 million are non-U.S. citizens, of which about 12 million make more than $50,000. They just choose not to buy insurance. People call them the free riders.
But the majority don't have insurance because they can't afford.
That's right, and that's the key. So it comes back to cost, and it really comes down to this cost coverage relationship. The more expensive it is in a system where healthcare is not mandatory to buy insurance, it's out of reach. People can't afford. On average, a policy for 4 people, a family, is about $13,000 in this country today. $13,000. That's anywhere from a third to almost a half of what the median income is for a family of 4. And you just can't take that much money when you've got to feed your children, put them in education days. So it really comes back, and we'll see it play out in presidential debate. People talk the uninsured, but I'll bet very quickly it's going to get down to the root cause, and that's cost. You can always mandate it. You can always call universal care. All that's fine. But unless you control the underlying cost within 3 or 4 years, you do start rationing, and you really end up having the mandates mean nothing. So it really is the cost. And then the cost, obviously, is what's driving the cost. And the cost, for most parts, we're a rich country overall compared to other countries, therefore we're willing to spend more. The technology that we have today, number 2, is a huge, the fact that we can do a heart-lung transplant like I do, or hip replacements, or knee replacements in the way that we do. And then there's inequities in distribution of care that mean there are huge variances around the country where there's an overuse in this country in some areas in terms of what is really effective.
Yeah, the Rand Corporation study 4 years ago now, that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, says that Americans get the right kind of care only 55% of the time. I love to cite that figure because that means another half of the time we are not getting the right kind of care, whether it's preventive or acute or chronic.
That's right. And people don't believe that figure very much when they hear it. It's true.
It's
true.
I
mean, there's no question, as a physician, that 55% of the time, it depends on what illness or what disease, but 55% of the time you get the care that is recommended to give the best outcome, the best value, and 45% you don't.
Quickly, I do want to ask you for your solutions to the high cost of health care. And then there's so many other things I'd like to talk to you about.
Well, I think we do need to work towards aggressively having 100% coverage of the American people, because without it, there's too much adverse selection. It is hard in a society such as ours, without reaching everybody, to have a distribution through an insurance mechanism that lowers cost overall. So that has got to be the goal.
Are you saying that you are in favor of mandate?
Doesn't have to be a mandate. I'm saying give 100% coverage. Once you say mandate, all sorts of connotations come up.
Right.
The easiest way to do it is to mandate it. It basically say you got to have it. You can get to effective 100% coverage of people through insurance without mandates. But the mechanism going to the cost issue is by capturing the power of 21st century information and choice today, which you couldn't do 10 years ago, with our computers, with transparency, with having people make decisions. I do think through a independent sort of consumer-driven system that is provider-friendly, so you got to be able to pay doctors, address malpractice insurance, that is centered on the individual, not just the patient, but the individual. That sort of mechanism, through transparency and competition, will lower cost. We talked earlier about Medicare. Right now, because of that competition, costs are coming in 30%. Markets don't traditionally work in healthcare because we are set up with an inequity in information. The doctor knows more than the patient. That's being blown away today as a doctor. Patients are coming in with what they've searched on the web and making recommendations. So just jumping ahead, I think a consumer-based, provider-friendly system that is consumer-driven, driven by 3 things: 21st century information, choice, and the element of control, because clearly people who can't afford it are going to have to be given a huge amount of help like we did in that Medicare bill.
I want to talk about you, Bill Frist, the humanitarian. Every year you go to Africa, some really, really poor country in a far tucked away. You can't even get to, right? You helicopter. Yeah. Every year you go and you perform surgery on the sick and the stricken.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's interesting that as a United States Senator, every year, maybe one exception, I spent 2 weeks to as long as a month in Africa. I don't go as a senator. I go as a physician. I don't go with security. I go in areas like southern Sudan, where the civil war has gone on for 24 years.
So you could have been shot at.
Well, could have been shot at. It could have been shot at. And the government, actually the government of Sudan at that time was bombing the south. They would bomb next to the hospital. They bombed the church there. Why? To disrupt life and to drive people back in the bush so they wouldn't challenge the government. But we started operating in a schoolhouse there. And 1997, 1998, had no running water, no electricity. People would come from the bush. They'd been driven back in the bush by the government in the Civil War. But when a physician came, all of a sudden they would come to have their hernia repaired or their hydatid cyst removed or their bowel obstruction. You would save one of those lives, and it might be a good guy or a bad guy. It might be somebody from the military, it might be somebody from the South. But what I saw time and time again is that trust that is built using medicine almost as a currency for peace allowed civilization to return, understanding return, people working together. So that little hospital that started in a room half this size, a little schoolhouse, without that running water or electricity, today has grown, and that hospital now sees about 45,000 people. There's a village there, there's a market, there are churches, there are schools, all in an area that had been decimated by the Civil War. And I've been able to do the same sort of thing. I've operated in Uganda and operated out through East Central Africa. And I come back to Washington, D.C., and I come back to our think tanks and share with them that story, that there's a huge opportunity for America to use not just military power and our strong Department of Defense, but to use humanitarian efforts, medicine, healing, as a currency for peace around the world. And I think that applies to Iraq and Afghanistan and Haiti and southern Sudan around the world. But it really comes from that being on the ground. Even as majority leader of the Senate, I'd slip down there and do this. Nobody would know about it and spend a few weeks at a time.
This article in the Princeton Alumni Weekly, lovely article about you, says that you're here teaching this year, but also you're here to contemplate the next stage of your career.
Right.
That next stage, is the focus going to be on global health?
Yeah. It may, for 20 years, it was one-on-one. I do heart and lung transplants is what I had done professionally. So I spent that time healing one-on-one. And then I said, I'm going to spend 12 years healing one on a larger community. That larger community, the state of Tennessee, and ultimately the country. And now I'm at a point for the next 10 or 12 years, do want to expand that even further and focus on healing one, on not just the individual, not just on a community, but on a global community. Addressing issues like HIV, AIDS, malaria, clean water, the fact that there's water in here, 1.2 billion people don't have access to clean water. And if you don't have clean water, children get infections, and then they develop diarrhea, cardiogenic shock, and it becomes the #1 killer in the world.
You said 10 million children die a year from drinking dirty water.
That's right. Well, there are 10 million. Right now there are 10 million kids less than 5 who die totally. The #1 killer within that group is lack of access to clean water. Isn't that amazing? So then you say, well, let's focus on issues of clean water. That may have the greatest impact, more than a heart-lung transplant that I do, more than being a senator, more than writing a piece of legislation, if we can make headway with my participation and others to address something as fundamental as clean water. There are 28,000 kids who die every day. 2/3 of those die of preventable causes that are cheap to prevent, cheap to treat, yet still 28,000 are dying every day. So we can probably save 2/3 of those lives, not spending a lot of money, but basically through education and application of what we know today.
It's interesting. You're said to admire Al Gore. Now, of course, he is about the environment. Are you hoping to be a Bill Frist of global health? raising the consciousness.
You know, I think
getting the parties together to work on this.
Yeah, I think what he has been able to do is elevate an issue that should have been obvious that was not. And in the same way, I'd like to contribute through a cause by working with AfriCare, a great NGO based in the United States, concentrating in Africa, by working with Save the Children, a tremendous non-government organization that focuses on those 28,000 children who die every day. I have a campaign, a global campaign called Survive to 5, where we're trying to raise about $60 million to focus on this particular issue. So I think that model of having somebody who has spent a time in public policy address big issues that are kind of obvious, but haven't yet had that light shine on them, is a model that I do both respect and admire and want to emulate.
How did you find Princeton students? How are they different from the students of your time?
Well, you know what I can't.
In other words, I guess I'm really asking: are you hopeful that we will have a next generation of leaders who will carry on the torch?
Yeah, the big difference is, and I was in the Woodrow Wilson School when I was here as an undergraduate, and then I'm teaching there now, is this global commitment, this awareness, more kids recognizing that they have a moral opportunity. I won't even call it responsibility because that's kind of elitist, but a moral opportunity to change the course of humanity. Martin Luther King, in that letter from a Birmingham jail, said we're caught in this inescapable network of mutuality and tied in a single garment of destiny. And these kids get that. From a practical standpoint, they can write very well. I think write better than the kids from 10 years ago. I think Princeton and other places have focused a lot more on communication. Smart, committed both domestically as well as globally. So I'm very optimistic, unlike a lot of politicians, about the future of America and America's role in the world, in development and growing economies, in humanitarian efforts, and in capturing this single garment of destiny that people understand today.
On that uplifting note, I'd like to thank you for being on our program. And this concludes our two-part conversation with Senator Bill Frist, former Senate Majority Leader, Princetonian. Princeton is proud of him, visionary, humanitarian, and thank you. Please join me thanking Senator Frist. Thank you for watching. See you next time. I'm Mei Chang for International Forum.